Picture this. You're standing in the opulent halls of Topkapi Palace in the year 1648, surrounded by marble columns and intricate mosaics that gleam in the afternoon sunlight. The air is thick with the scent of rose water and incense, but there's something else lingering beneath the perfume, something that makes your blood run cold. You hear the distant sound of women weeping, their voices echoing through corridors that have witnessed centuries of imperial splendor and unimaginable cruelty. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of Ottoman excess or palace intrigue. It's the horrifying truth about what happened to the hundreds of women who dedicated their lives to serving the most powerful men on earth, only to be discarded like broken pottery when their usefulness expired. The stories you're about to hear will shatter every romanticized notion you've ever had about harem life and reveal one of history's most systematic examples of institutionalized brutality against women. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters of the past together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared need to understand how power corrupts. Absolutely. The name Ibrahim the Mad might not be familiar to you, but his reign of terror between 1640 and 1648 represents one of the most chilling examples of what happened when Ottoman sultans decided their concubines had outlived their purpose. What he did to 280 innocent women in a single night of madness will haunt you long after you finish listening to this video. But to understand the true horror of what befell these discarded women, we need to first understand the golden cage they inhabited, a world where beauty was both blessing and curse, where a woman's entire existence depended on the whims of a man who held the power of life and death over millions. The imperial harem wasn't just a collection of the sultan's wives and concubines. It was a highly organized institution that functioned like a cross between a luxury prison and a training academy for human dolls. Hundreds of women lived within its walls, each one representing years of careful selection, brutal conditioning, and systematic erasure of their original identities. These women didn't choose their fate. They were captured in wars that ravaged their homelands, presented as diplomatic gifts by foreign rulers desperate to curry favor, or purchased from slave markets that operated throughout the empire. Some were as young as 8 or 9 when they first walked through those palace gates, their childhood memories the only connection to lives they would never see again. The selection process was methodical and cruel. Beauty alone wasn't enough. The women had to possess a specific combination of physical perfection, intelligence, and psychological made them suitable malleability that for molding into imperial playthings. Those who showed too much independence or resistance simply disappeared, their fate serving as a warning to others about the price of defiance. Once inside the harem, these women entered a world governed by rules designed to break their spirits while maintaining their usefulness. They were given new names, forced to abandon their native languages, and trained in arts that had nothing to do with personal fulfillment and everything to do with pleasing their master. They learned to dance, to sing, to compose poetry, and to perform in ways that would make grown men weep with desire. But perhaps most insidiously, they were taught to compete with each other for scraps of imperial attention. The harem hierarchy was deliberately designed to pit woman against woman, creating a system where survival depended on destroying others who might threaten your position. Friendships were dangerous luxuries that could be weaponized against you. Trust was a weakness that could cost you everything. The lucky few who caught the Sultan's eye might rise to become favorites, accumulating wealth and influence that seemed to promise security. But even these privileged women lived with the constant knowledge that their elevated status was temporary, that a younger, more beautiful rival could appear at any moment and render them obsolete. For the vast majority of harem women, Life was an endless cycle of preparation for encounters that might never come. They spent years perfecting skills they might never use, maintaining beauty standards that grew more impossible with age, and hoping for recognition from a man who viewed them as interchangeable objects rather than individual human beings. The daily routine was designed to reinforce their powerlessness. They woke at dawn for prayers they had been forced to adopt, spent hours on personal grooming that served only to maintain their market value, and filled the remaining time with activities that kept them occupied but never truly independent. Reading was limited to approved texts, conversations were monitored by supervisors, and any display of homesickness or resistance was quickly punished. But it was the psychological conditioning that proved most devastating. The women were systematically taught to measure their worth entirely through male approval, to see other women as threats rather than allies, and to accept their powerlessness as natural and inevitable. They learned to smile while their hearts broke, to express gratitude for treatment that would horrify free women, and to find joy in moments of basic human kindness that should have been their birthright. The harem operated on a complex economy of favor and punishment that kept the women trapped in cycles of hope and despair. Small privileges, a better room, nicer clothing, access to books or musical instruments became precious rewards that could be withdrawn at any moment. The constant uncertainty about their future created a state of chronic anxiety that made long-term planning impossible and resistance seem futile. As years passed, the women watched themselves age in mirrors that became daily reminders of their diminishing value. They saw younger arrivals receive the attention they once enjoyed, witnessed friends disappear without explanation, and gradually understood that their own usefulness was measured in fleeting moments of imperial pleasure. The most tragic aspect of harem life was how it corrupted the women's relationships with each other. The system deliberately fostered jealousy, competition, and betrayal as survival strategies. Women who might have been natural allies in the outside world became rivals competing for resources, attention, and ultimately, the right to continue existing. Those who survived long enough to see their beauty fade faced a terrifying reality. They had become surplus inventory in an institution that valued only youth and novelty. Their years of service, their sacrificed identities, their accumulated wisdom about palace life meant nothing when weighed against the promise of fresh faces and untouched bodies. The older women lived in a state of suspended terror, knowing that each new arrival of young slaves brought them closer to obsolescence. They had witnessed enough disappearances to understand that the Ottoman Empire had little use for aging concubines. But the specific methods of disposal remained shrouded in whispered rumors and half-told stories that were even more frightening than the truth. Some tried to make themselves useful in other ways, becoming mentors to younger women, developing expertise in palace management, or cultivating relationships with powerful eunuchs who might protect them. But these strategies only delayed the inevitable reckoning with a system that viewed human beings as disposable resources. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be overstated. Women who had once dreamed of love, family, and independence found themselves grateful for moments of basic human dignity. They learned to find meaning in serving men who saw them as objects, to take pride in skills that existed solely for others' pleasure, and to accept isolation from the world beyond palace walls as the price of survival. Yet even in this environment of systematic dehumanization, some spark of humanity persisted. The women developed secret languages of support, sharing food when possible, offering comfort during illness, and maintaining underground networks of information that helped them navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics. These small acts of rebellion against their imposed isolation represented the only form of resistance available to them. But as we'll discover, even these carefully guarded bonds between the women would prove insufficient protection against the ultimate brutality that awaited those who fell from imperial favor. The fate that befell Ibrahim's 280 concubines in 1648 would demonstrate just how little their years of service, their accumulated wisdom, and their desperate loyalty meant when a sultan's mood turned dark. The whispers that echoed through those marble corridors carried stories that would make your blood freeze. Tales of what happened when the golden cage became a death trap, when beauty became a liability, and when the very women who had sacrificed everything for imperial pleasure discovered the true cost of their devotion. The system that would ultimately destroy these women was codified in Ottoman law through a legal framework that granted sultans absolute power over life and death. This wasn't casual cruelty or spontaneous violence. It was institutionalized brutality backed by centuries of legal precedent and religious justification. The concept of siyaseten qatl, or political execution, gave sultans the legal authority to eliminate anyone they deemed harmful to the empire's stability. Originally designed to deal with political threats and criminal behavior, this law became a weapon of terror against the most vulnerable members of imperial society. Concubines, as slaves rather than citizens, had no legal protections whatsoever. They existed in a legal void, where their lives could be ended with less ceremony than required to slaughter livestock. This legal framework didn't emerge from nowhere. It was carefully constructed over generations to serve the empire's needs for absolute control. The same laws that justified the systematic murder of infant princes extended seamlessly to cover the disposal of inconvenient women. The Ottoman legal system treated both groups as potential threats to imperial stability, worthy of elimination whenever their existence became problematic. But the law was only the beginning. The practical mechanisms for disposing of unwanted concubines were as varied as they were horrifying. Each method designed to send specific messages to the surviving women about the price of disobedience or obsolescence. Drowning was perhaps the most common method, chosen for its symbolic significance as much as its practical efficiency. Water cleansed the empire of impurity, the religious scholars explained, while the Bosporus Strait served as a convenient disposal site that carried evidence away from the palace. The women would be bound in weighted sacks, conscious and terrified, before being thrown from boats in the dead of night. The process was ritualized to maximize psychological impact on witnesses. The condemned women were often forced to watch their companions die before facing their own execution, creating scenes of unimaginable terror as friends begged for mercy that would never come. The survivors would carry these images for the rest of their lives, understanding that their own fate hung by the thinnest of threads. Strangulation offered another favored method, particularly for women whose deaths needed to appear more dignified or whose bodies might be discovered by foreign diplomats. Silk scarves became instruments of murder, wielded by deaf-mute executioners who could never testify about what they had witnessed. The irony was deliberate. The same luxurious materials that had once adorned these women's bodies became the tools of their destruction. The palace employed specialists in these executions, men who had perfected the art of killing without leaving obvious evidence of violence. They understood exactly how much pressure to apply, how long to maintain their grip, and how to position bodies to suggest natural death rather than murder. These executioners moved through the palace like shadows, appearing whenever their services were required and disappearing just as quickly. Some sultans preferred more elaborate methods that combined execution with entertainment, turning the women's deaths into spectacles that reinforced imperial power while satisfying twisted desires for psychological dominance. These public displays served multiple purposes. They eliminated unwanted women while demonstrating to surviving concubines the absolute nature of their powerlessness. The timing of these mass eliminations followed predictable patterns that revealed the calculated nature of the violence. New sultans often marked their accession by clearing out their predecessors' harem, treating the women like furniture that needed replacing. The arrival of particularly beautiful new slaves might trigger purges of older women whose continued existence reminded the Sultan of his own aging. Political crises provided convenient excuses for eliminating women whose loyalty might be questioned. Economic difficulties could justify reducing the harem's size as a cost-saving measure. Religious festivals offered opportunities to frame mass murder as spiritual purification. The sultans and their advisors became experts at finding justifications for violence they intended to commit, regardless of circumstances. The women who faced these fates understood their situation with devastating clarity. They had spent years observing the palace's rhythms, noting which events preceded disappearances, recognizing the signs that indicated their usefulness was ending. This knowledge became its own form of torture. They could see death approaching, but remained powerless to prevent it. Some tried desperate measures to extend their lives. They might volunteer for the most degrading services, hoping to prove their continued value through absolute submission. Others attempted to gather intelligence about palace politics, believing that usefulness as informants might outweigh their declining physical appeal. A few sought to cultivate relationships with influential eunuchs or palace officials who might intercede on their behalf. But these strategies only delayed the inevitable while adding new layers of psychological torment. Women who had already sacrificed their dignity found themselves surrendering their last shreds of humanity in futile attempts to purchase a few more months of life. The palace system was designed to extract maximum value from its human resources before discarding them, and no amount of desperate cooperation could change the fundamental mathematics of imperial convenience. The bureaucracy surrounding these eliminations was as chilling as the violence itself. Palace officials maintained meticulous records of harem inventory, tracking which women were approaching obsolescence and calculating the optimal timing for their disposal. They developed sophisticated systems for categorizing the concubines, those whose deaths might cause diplomatic complications, those whose elimination would send useful messages to survivors, and those who could disappear without anyone noticing or caring. These records reveal the complete dehumanization that preceded mass murder. The women were reduced to statistics on administrative ledgers: ages, origins, special skills, potential political connections, and estimated remaining useful life. Palace accountants calculated the costs of maintaining aging concubines against the benefits of replacing them with younger models, treating human lives as line items in imperial budgets. The logistics of mass execution required careful planning and substantial resources. Palace officials needed to coordinate with executioners, arrange for body disposal, manage the psychological impact on surviving women, and maintain the fiction that nothing unusual had occurred. These operations involved dozens of people, all sworn to secrecy, but all complicit in systematic murder. The aftermath of these eliminations created its own set of challenges for palace administrators. Surviving women needed to be managed and controlled, their trauma channeled into renewed submission rather than dangerous desperation. New arrivals had to be integrated into the hierarchy without learning too much about their probable fate. Foreign diplomats and visitors required careful handling to prevent uncomfortable questions about missing faces. But perhaps most revealing was how quickly the palace machinery adapted to these absences. Rooms were reassigned, possessions redistributed, and daily routines adjusted as if the murdered women had never existed. The institutional memory of the harem was deliberately short, designed to erase inconvenient truths and maintain the fiction that imperial service was an honor rather than a death sentence. The psychological impact on the executioners themselves was carefully managed through a combination of material rewards and spiritual justification. These men were told they served the empire's highest interests, that their actions preserved stability and order, that the women they killed were obstacles to imperial greatness. They received substantial payments, special privileges, and protection from prosecution. But they also lived with the knowledge that their own usefulness was equally temporary. The most chilling aspect of these systematic eliminations was how they were presented to the outside world. Ottoman officials became masters of euphemism and misdirection, developing elaborate cover stories that transformed mass murder into administrative necessity. When European diplomats inquired about missing women, they were told tales of voluntary retirement, marriage to provincial officials, or transfer to other imperial households. These lies required constant maintenance and careful coordination among palace staff. Everyone from the lowest servants to the highest ministers needed to maintain the same fictional narrative, creating a web of complicity that extended throughout the imperial apparatus. The women who disappeared were gradually erased from official records, their names removed from registers, their possessions quietly redistributed, their very existence denied. The surviving concubines became unwilling participants in this deception, forced to act as if their murdered friends had simply moved on to better lives. They learned to speak in coded language about the fates of their companions, developing subtle ways to acknowledge loss without admitting to knowledge of crimes. This enforced silence became another form of psychological torture, denying the women even the comfort of mourning their dead. But the most devastating realization for these survivors was understanding that their own deaths would be similarly concealed and denied. They would vanish into the same bureaucratic void that had swallowed their companions, leaving no trace of their suffering, no record of their resistance, no acknowledgement of their humanity. The empire's machinery of violence was designed not just to kill, but to erase, ensuring that future generations would never learn the true cost of imperial splendor. These marble halls still echo with the cries of 280 women whose lives were snuffed out in a single night of imperial madness. Their stories remind us that behind every empire's golden facade lies a foundation built on human suffering. Today, their forgotten voices whisper across centuries, demanding we remember that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it destroys everything beautiful it touches.